Hello, I am Captain Hope Salvucci, 5th Armor Brigade Judge Advocate. Today, I will be discussing the rules of engagement with you. To start, let's talk about what the rules of engagement, or ROE, are. Rules of engagement are directives issued by the commander that explain when, under what circumstances, and how soldiers may use force. Ultimately, the unit commander is responsible for ROE. Keep in mind that ROE are policy, not law. ROE are an operational issue, and the ROE must support the commander's intent and operational concept to ensure mission success. Because of this, ROE are flexible and tailorable to the mission. Now let's discuss the underlying reasons why we have rules of engagement. ROE serve important political, operational, and legal functions. First, ROE serve an important political function by reflecting national, strategic, and diplomatic objectives. ROE also provide guidance from the Secretary of Defense and President, as well as subordinate commanders, to deployed units on the use of force. Second, ROE perform an operational function. The ROE act as a ceiling on the level of force that can be used. Because the ROE are permissive, they regulate a subordinate commander's use of force. Additionally, the ROE act as a control mechanism for the transition from peacetime to war. Finally, the ROE perform a legal function by facilitating planning and providing guidance on the commander's rights and obligations and how soldiers should act to ensure compliance with law and policy. Judge advocates advise on the ROE, but commanders are the ultimate decision makers. Now that we have a basic understanding of ROE, let's discuss the Standing Rules of Engagement, or SRO. The SRO were approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2005. They provide guidance on the use of force across the full spectrum of military missions, to include military operations, contingency operations, and routine military department functions such as anti-terrorism and force protection duties. SRO also apply to air and maritime homeland defense missions. The SRO distinguish between self-defense and the use of force for the accomplishment of an assigned mission. The SRO establish policies and procedures for commanders and soldiers governing planning and actions in all military operations. The SRO contains supplemental measures that may be requested by commanders to tailor unit ROE to specific mission requirements. Special instructions, or SPINs, govern air operations and contain ROE-like guidance. The SRO addresses 4 levels of self-defense: national, collective, unit, and individual. Who is responsible for the standing rules of engagement? All soldiers must implement the ROE and SRO according to the commander's guidance. Judge advocates play a significant role in developing and integrating ROE into operational planning and execution. And as we already discussed, all commanders are responsible for establishing ROE for mission accomplishment and ensuring ROE compliance. Earlier, I mentioned that rules of engagement are policy, not law. You may have already received training on the law of armed conflict, but keep in mind that the ROE is not the same thing as the law of armed conflict, or LOAC. LOAC is a consistent body of law that provides a minimum standard of conduct. The ROE can and should change as units transition across the competition and conflict spectrum. The ROE can never authorize a violation of the LOAC. Commanders and soldiers must comply with both ROE and LOAC, and ROE violations may also violate LOAC. Both ROE and LOAC violations are potentially prosecutable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and other legal or administrative actions may occur. War crimes are serious violations of LOAC that are punishable by criminal sanctions. In circumstances where violations of ROE do not rise to a level that would merit UCMJ action, a variety of adverse administrative actions are at a commander's disposal. Now let's discuss the specific provisions of the 2005 Standing Rules of Engagement. The inherent right to self-defense is the right to defend oneself and other U.S. forces in the vicinity from a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent. When individuals are assigned and acting as part of a unit, individual self-defense should be considered a subset of unit self-defense. Unit commanders may limit individual self-defense by members of their unit. Unit self-defense is the act of defending elements or personnel of a defined unit, as well as U.S. forces in the vicinity thereof, against a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent. Unless otherwise directed by a unit commander, soldiers may exercise individual self-defense in response to a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent. Unit commanders always retain the inherent right and obligation to exercise unit self-defense in response to a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent. The inherent right to self-defense arises following a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent. A hostile act is defined as an attack or other use of force against the United States, U.S. forces, and in certain circumstances, U.S. nationals, their property, U.S. commercial assets, and/or other designated non-U.S. forces, foreign nationals, and their property. Hostile acts include force used directly to preclude or impede the mission and/or duties of U.S. forces, including the recovery of U.S. personnel and vital U.S. government property. A hostile act triggers the right to use all necessary means available and all appropriate actions in self-defense to deter, neutralize, or destroy the threat. Unless otherwise directed by a unit commander, soldiers may exercise individual self-defense in response to a hostile act. Now let's talk about hostile intent. Hostile intent is defined as the threat of imminent use of force against the United States, U.S. forces, or other designated persons and property. It is also the threat of force used directly to preclude or impede the mission and/or duties of U.S. forces, including the recovery of U.S. personnel and vital U.S. government property. When hostile intent is present, the right exists to use all necessary means available and all appropriate actions in self-defense. Again, unit commanders retain the inherent right and obligation to exercise unit self-defense in response to demonstrated hostile intent. Unless otherwise directed by a unit commander, soldiers may exercise individual self-defense in response to demonstrated hostile intent. You might be wondering how to determine if a threat of use of force is imminent. That determination will be based on an assessment of all facts and circumstances known to U.S. forces at the time and may be made at any level. Imminent does not necessarily mean immediate or instantaneous. For example, discovering an insurgent planting an IED may constitute an imminent threat, even though the insurgent does not intend to detonate it immediately. Again, unit commanders retain the inherent right and obligation to exercise unit self-defense in response to a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent. To determine if use of force is imminent, consider the METT-C factors. So far, we've discussed the right to self-defense based on others' conduct. Another key concept within the rules of engagement is a declared hostile force. Once a force is declared to be hostile, U.S. units may engage it without observing a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent. The basis for engagement shifts from conduct to status. A declared hostile force can be any paramilitary or military force or non-state armed group declared hostile by appropriate U.S. authority. An example of a declared hostile force would be the German military in World War II. American forces could engage German forces in World War II based off their status as a declared hostile force. Now we'll discuss some other types of self-defense. National self-defense is the act of defending the United States, U.S. forces, and in certain circumstances, U.S. citizens and their property and U.S. commercial assets from a hostile act, demonstrated hostile intent, or declared hostile force. For example, following the September 11th attacks, ROE governing engagement of aircraft flown by terrorists within the United States were developed. Collective self-defense. Collective self-defense is the act of defending designated non-U.S. citizens, forces, property, and interests from a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent. Only the President or the Secretary of Defense may authorize the exercise of collective self-defense. Collective self-defense is generally implemented during combined operations. Next, let's discuss the principles of self-defense. But remember, all necessary means available and all appropriate actions may be used in self-defense. First, de-escalation. When time and circumstances permit, the forces committing hostile acts or hostile intent should be warned and given the opportunity to withdraw or cease actions. The second principle of self-defense is necessity. Necessity exists when a hostile act occurs or when a force demonstrates hostile intent. When such conditions exist, use of force in self-defense is authorized while the force continues to commit hostile acts or exhibit hostile intent. The third principle of self-defense is proportionality. The use of force in self-defense should be sufficient to respond decisively to hostile acts or demonstrations of hostile intent. Such use of force may exceed the means and intensity of the hostile act or hostile intent, but the nature, duration, and scope of force used should not exceed what is required. The concept of proportionality in self-defense should not be confused with attempts to minimize collateral damage during offensive operations. The final principle of self-defense is pursuit. U.S. forces have authority to pursue and engage forces that have committed hostile acts and/or forces that have demonstrated hostile intent if those forces continue to commit hostile acts or demonstrate hostile intent. Escalation of force procedures essentially follow self-defense rules. Where a hostile act or demonstration of hostile intent makes the use of force authorized, use only that force necessary to neutralize the threat. Escalation of force procedures are not limitations on the right to self-defense. When a force is necessary to defend against a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent. Where time and circumstances allow, employment of means short of deadly force without endangering soldiers, escalation of force procedures may minimize the loss of life and prevent unnecessary suffering. Escalation of force procedures are part of mission analysis. Escalation of force procedures necessarily depend upon the tactical situation and the time and resources available. Leaders should consider the full range of visible, audible, and physical means available, and then plan, publish, and train on the escalation of force procedures prior to mission execution. Escalation of force procedures are not a step-by-step procedure, but rather they offer a menu of options. Escalation of force steps are usually listed from least to most deadly, but are not intended to require sequential application. Soldiers may move up and down the list as necessary to achieve the desired effect. Where necessary for self-defense, soldiers can jump directly to deadly force. The goal of escalation of force is to use that amount of force necessary for the situation. An example, when a soldier is on foot against dismounted persons, are the 5 S's: shout, show, shove, shoot a warning shot if authorized, and then shoot an aimed shot. Escalation of force procedures do not apply to declared hostile forces. Soldiers may engage members of a declared hostile force with deadly force unless they have been specifically ordered not to do so for operational reasons, if the declared hostile force attempts to surrender, if the force is wounded and out of the fight, or captured. Again, escalation of force procedures are not a substitute for, but are part of the rules of engagement. Escalation of force is an aspect of the ROE that helps commanders and soldiers apply the principles of self-defense. However, commanders and soldiers must understand that ROE may limit escalation of force options. For example, the rules of engagement may not authorize warning shots. Finally, let's discuss mission-specific ROE. Supplemental measures allow commanders to tailor ROE for mission accomplishment during the conduct of DoD operations. There are two types of supplemental measures. One, those supplemental measures that specify certain actions that require Secretary of Defense or combatant command approval. And two, those measures that allow commanders to place limits on the use of force during the conduct of certain actions. Again, the SRO are designed to be permissive in nature. So unless a specific weapon or tactic requires Secretary of Defense or combatant command approval, or unless a specific weapon or tactic is restricted by an approved supplemental measure or by the law of armed conflict or ROE, commanders may use any lawful weapon available for mission accomplishment. Supplemental measures may also be used by unit commanders to limit individual self-defense by members of their unit, when in the context of exercising the right and obligation of unit self-defense. Commanders at all levels may use supplemental measures to restrict the rules of engagement when appropriate. In summary, knowing the SRO is vital to readiness and mission accomplishment. Every soldier must understand their right to self-defense, subject to the commander's guidance, the applicable ROE, and the restrictions issued by the appropriate authorities, and be prepared to receive theater and mission-specific ROE. The SRO are permissive in nature. Unless specifically restricted by the law of armed conflict or ROE, commanders may use any weapon or tactic for mission accomplishment. Thank you for your attention during today's training. I hope you have a better understanding of the rules of engagement. If you have any questions, please direct them through your task force chain of command.